So we run around just quick intros, just anyone who missed out on the 2 days of discussions, just open up on each of us. Nick?
I think you know me because I just presented, so I'll let it.
I obviously spoke this morning, CEO of Havas Lynx, very much focused on good pharma and what that can mean for us.
And I too spoke this morning, Shona Davies, Merck, Univadis, Global Communications and Program Lead.
And Rene Neubach spoke yesterday, former Pfizer eMarketing manager and now trying to educate pharma companies on digital marketing.
Yeah, so I'll kick off. There was a PHR question that was raised, and one of the things we found was interesting with HealthVol is that for animals it proved more compelling and interesting to owners of small animal pets in the UK. So the adoption of PHRs by patients within the NHS has been abysmally small. Services there provisioned 0.0%, engagement very low. Same thing happened when they went to into private sector, very low engagement levels. People would get opted in just automatically using a private clinic in Harley Street. But then when they put it for small animals, they found this massive interest. People want to register their dogs' vaccines, and that was quite interesting. But one of the funny things we saw then was with Kaiser Permanente in the US, they took a mobile-first approach to their development. So they were developed for mobile before, and what they found was the fastest ever adoption of digital records. Any digital record service, within the first month, 10% of their patients had gone on and used this, and because they'd focused on making it available on mobile. And the amazing thing was when they showed this at a Health 2.0 conference, people said, "What's the average age of your customer then?" And they were like, 69. And it just shows it's not an age-related thing, it's a convenience and an ease. I think people like Walgreens are really showing that with repeat prescriptions via mobile text message and stuff like that. You make this stuff easy enough, make it engaging and interesting enough, people don't really want to go and log on to a PC at home. And I think that right across all age categories. We're seeing something like that.
I think the interesting thing around personal health records versus electronic health records, and I make a distinction there because I think it's a differential in terms of the technology, the platform, the app that you use, and whether or not you're the healthcare consumer or the provider. And I make that distinction also because I think you see a fragmentation of services. So Kaiser developed their own app. There are myriad services coming out. I know one that's about to be launched in Portugal, which is very much patient-centered. Patients can download it and then get their doctors to sign up. What's interesting to me is that, okay, that might facilitate an interaction between patient and healthcare professional at an individual level. But then when we're also looking about sharing care records amongst service providers, say that patient has to now go up to secondary care, or they move and they now need to go to another place. There's an interesting dichotomy, I think, between do we share that information in the back end with the providers? Do the patients enable that sharing? And what happens in emergency situations? Stuff like that. So there's a privacy aspect to how that information gets shared and who has the consent to be able to share that information with someone else. And then interesting, again, from within a governmental institution like the NHS, where you would probably have one system that they're trying to get everybody onto, versus a more commercial system in the US where you're likely to have loads of different services popping up.
Yeah, I think the incentive is the big thing I'm seeing. So patients are saying, why do I want to engage with this? I'm just making it easy for my care providers to do stuff. So a lot of the time, one of the things Kaiser did, central to it, was that you would be able to communicate with your nurse and your doctor team. And actually, if you look at what the NHS built, they built a thing, and it was sort of like online banking, but it was like online access to a spreadsheet. You couldn't actually pay your bills or anything. So you couldn't do your healthcare. You couldn't ask your doctor a question through the NHS portal. And that, to me, is a health space that failed to lack with that engagement process at the back end where the doctors would be there for their patients. I think there's no incentive. I'm just making your job easier. You've got to try and make the patient's lives easier as a prerequisite for it to be interesting.
One of the things I found unbelievably interesting, a great example of using innovation to communicate with the patients. I was at an event much smaller than this, talking about social media, and the person who followed me was a psychiatric nurse from, I think it was North Yorkshire. And people were on the Twitter and the Blackberries, and she was talking, and I quickly realised that her passion and commitment to innovation and communication with patients was absolutely stunning. And they were talking about monitoring schizophrenic patients using Twitter. So in the same way they have a call centre and they're ready on calls, they're also monitoring the handles for these patients. She spoke about how on the Monday of that week, someone had like flagged that they were feeling potentially suicidal, and they'd had someone on site within an hour. And I was actually spectacularly embarrassed that, being from the sort of pharma sector and with the budgets and the investments we've got and the challenges we face when we do digital and social and mobile, that, you know, something of almost like an individual trust, individuals in it, which has been so simply pioneering. So for me, it's not always about being as big as you need to be, it's actually about having the ideas and the conviction to make a difference. It was a great example.
What do you think is the most exciting thing you've seen in mobile? It doesn't have to be your company then, you know.
So since I'm also working in Austria together with an agency who is very much focusing on mobile, and there are a lot of quite good startups in Austria, but they're all initiated by patients actually who develop apps based on the needs that they actually have, right? And those are the apps that become successful. And they some of the apps, so there is a quite famous one which is called MySugar. It's founded by 4 diabetes patients actually. And they developed a model where they can include pharma and actually to increase the reach of this application a little bit, also of course making a profitable application out of it, but also it's for them, it's for pharma a good way to get involved into providing support for the patient, right? And I think that's one of the ways forward. I do not believe that pharma will ever be just like the big creator of applications that will make a difference. So there might be a rather different way of thinking about how there are great apps out there. Why not support those apps in a way like the one that I just described?
I was debating with Nick, and we've talked about this on a few occasions, and for me it's one of the big, I don't even know if it's a big question yet, but it certainly should be when it comes to mobile apps, and we spoke about it before, and that's around the concept of like ownership. So who actually owns the app? You know, is it the company who's published the app, or is it the individual that's purchased the app through, in this example, iTunes? For example, if I walk into Apple and I buy an iBook, Apple are never going to come to me and say, I'm going to have to update that, or I want to take it back, because it's mine, it's in my house. So what does that mean to the kind of app world, you know, in terms of once I've downloaded an app, whose responsibility is it then to keep updated? Because I no longer own it, the individual who's downloaded it does, which is an interesting thought. I don't know what the answer is.
I make it now an ethical question, actually, because it is my ethical obligation. If I make a product available to my audience, then I have to take care it's updated. I think it's a simple ethical answer to it.
But when you can publish the update, which I agree with, but you still rely on someone else to actually action that update.
Right.
And that's where, you know, you've done your obligation. Great. That's where you've done your obligation, but also you're relying upon someone else, and it's their physical thing.
But I agree with you. I think you, in some ways, this is no different than if you bought I don't know, a television, and yes, you owned the television, but actually the company found out that every so often the television burst into flames in people's houses. They'd have to do all they could to make sure that they notified them and let those people make that decision. And similarly, if there's a tablet out there where suddenly we discover an adverse event, we have to do everything possible to rectify it. And I think sometimes that may be where we're failing at the moment, in that I showed the Dear Doctor letter there. You know, we're great at spreading news that's good in various channels and media, but when something's bad, how do we use those channels to withdraw medicine, to notify of bad news or things that haven't worked out? And what's our responsibility to do that? How bad does it have to be before we go all out? Are we a bit reticent to actually use all those channels about bad stuff? That's a sort of ethical question, I think, for us.
I think the opportunity to fix it has never been easier. So in my own experience, I bought a book off my brother who was in medical school above me, but I didn't realise that he'd bought the biochemistry book off my other brother who was doing veterinary about 4 years before. So I had a Krebs cycle that went the wrong way round. So whenever I did Vivas or anything or exams on biochemistry, I was explaining to someone something he was teaching 7 years ago, saying you've got a very good understanding of the old way we used to think about, you know, how biochemistry worked. And I see today we switch off applications if I walk out of a hospital. You know, so the ability, for example, if we've got content out there, to turn it off and make it reactivated, this is something that's within the application design ability that, you know, you've got to keep it current or it won't work. And so if we're looking at something like BNF, a national formulary, there's no more doctors going around with old copies of that in the UK because they have it downloaded for free to their phone as part of an NHS arrangement now. And it means that their formulary for prescribing is always up to date. And if they haven't updated it, they can't, you know, open it. And I think so we can actually design it out. And we never had that opportunity of taking them old books out of the doctor's hands. I think maybe the problem is just a technological thing we're going through at the moment, unawareness of a solution.
And I think that speaks to also a knowledge of understanding how the technology works and what you're trying to achieve with it. You know, I often raise a point, whether we're talking about mobile apps or we're talking about creating a website or putting, I often get asked, why haven't you put discussion forums on Univadis? It's my favorite topic. The question I always ask back is, well, why? Why are we doing an app? Why are we doing a discussion board? Why do you do this website? Way back in the early days of the internet, people were throwing websites up all over the place because they thought they had to, not because there was an actual reason behind it or because there was an actual value proposition that they were trying to, or a goal that they were trying to achieve. Yeah. So if you've got a goal, then you've got to educate yourself in how to achieve that goal. And knowing that you can use certain features of the technology to be able to, I don't want to say wipe the content, but you could do things like that make it easy to ensure that you've done your due diligence in ensuring that the information is as up to date as possible. And speaking at it from perhaps not the ethical side of it, but more from just a you know, we work with a lot of content providers. We're under contractual obligations to make sure that these things get updated, and it leads to some interesting discussions about what are you allowed to publish on a mobile app, what are you not allowed to publish on a mobile app, and what can be archived on the device, what can't be archived on the device. But there's all sorts of different technological tools that make it possible to deal with those challenges.
Okay, this just a discussion point. I'm currently working for one of my customers on trying to write a paper. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a compliance, etc., but I'm interviewing lots of people internally for them. What is the difference between a mobile medical app and a mobile app? And from digging around, it all comes down to European Directive Article 1.2a and the interpretation of monitoring. And I've seen the same application in one country where they've said that's fine, and in exactly the same application in a different country, and that's not fine. And yet they're all, the local implications are that they should interpret the European directive. Any comments on that?
And I can only give you an example from an internal perspective. So back in Pfizer, we had an application that would give parents the opportunity to track immunization for their children, of course, in line with one of our products. From a European perspective, it will not be considered a medical device. I think that's what you're referring to, right? But just like colleagues in some other markets, where the internal legal departments were just like having fear, probably, right, would consider it being a medical device and would have stepped back. And then coming to what you just said, it's just like it feels so, okay, we should have pushed harder on that one because a certification costs, I don't know, in German-speaking markets, costs you between 10 to 15, probably 20 for a bigger application. 1,000 euros, but what's the value for the patients and then the return on the image onto the company. So from my perspective, it's not only that some countries, it's not necessarily the countries that make a differentiation, it is the internal legal departments that make the differentiation probably.
I think we also have to take cognizance of the fact that excuse me, a lot of the guidance around what is a medical device in an app is fairly new. I mean, the FDA only published their guidance last week or 2 weeks ago, end of September. So, you know, from my experience of regulatory type documentation, is it evolves, right? It takes forever to evolve, but it does actually evolve. And I think the people are starting to just put a stake in the ground. You know, the FDA regulations say that it's all about whether or not you're using that app to diagnose and treat an individual patient. or at least that's my interpretation of what I read, and I'm sure there's other interpretations out there, but that's one stake in the ground. The other stake in the ground, the EU directives as well, around monitoring and stuff. I think at some point we will eventually find an equilibrium where it's probably fairly, I wouldn't say standard, but there's parity from one country to another, but I think it's too early for that right now.
I mean, there isn't. This is one of those areas where, you know, we say that there are clearly grey lines. But getting back to the principles, why is the regulation there? It's there to prevent harm to people. And if an app, the more complex an app gets, and the chances of whatever it calculates causing harm, if it does it badly, the more likely it is that it's going to require regulation. But where you draw that line is drawn differently, or it's drawn differently in different countries. I see in the US they've put like hundreds of examples, which I think probably helps, of the things that they do think fall under their scrutiny and things that they don't. But ultimately, it's all about the potential harm from an app calculating something wrongly.
Yeah, I think these guidelines are being drawn up by people who don't understand what the opportunity is or the challenge is. If I was in a position where I had to develop for a pharma brand an application, I'd get someone like Nick in and I'd say, you know, run your compliance, worst case scenario on this, try and tell me what's happening. But what I'm seeing with the regulators, and I think it's very disappointing, is it's restricting people with entrepreneurial mindsets like clinicians and patients who are seeing opportunities and are not going for it because they hit regulatory hurdles. So, for example, weighing scale producers, or, you know, someone who's got something that can look at stuff, you know, vital signs or whatever, and then they don't, with a weighing scale, they don't want to put on triggers for things like very rapid weight gain, very rapid weight loss, and maybe a questionnaire that links to helping people go to a GP. And because if they in any way say in the literature that this is what they provide a catch-all for with their weighing scale, they then become a regulated device. So people are trying to actually dumb down the sensory opportunity, and we're seeing so I've seen so many people here like Samsung S4, you've got this eye tracker thing, and I think that's the best example of where we've had this dumbed down. So the guys in Korea have developed this technology which watches your eyeballs, and you think, and they use it to power down the screen or to scroll automatically so that you can see where you're reading. But if you think about it, you know, whenever you go to the doctor after a bit of concussion, everyone in this room's had you know, at some point the finger moved. This is a neurological test that can be done by your mobile phone every single time it looks at you. What happens when a patient says, I had a stroke, my smart scroll stopped working, and why didn't Samsung give me this? And they said, well, the regulator actually stopped us bringing in innovation like that. And I think there will be a class action when you realise there's 20 million devices out there now with neurological examination tool on them that's had to be turned off because, you know, the technology makers can't pitch this stuff. But no one can even begin to estimate what it's stopping people like pharma and like the entrepreneurs who can develop apps with them making. You know, because how can you imagine what innovations could come? So I think ignore the regulators, go to people who understand the problems that can happen, build out so you avoid those. But we saw patients yesterday saying, you know, my doctor started Skyping me, the hospital went crazy, the doctor moved home. So Michael Serres, watch his video, and he just said the doctor went home and started Skyping from home. And then the hospital said, actually it'd be better you just came in and Skyped, you know. Because it just doesn't make sense you being at home Skyping. And one of the doctors we did some work with, she got in trouble for Skyping a patient, and they said, what are you doing using this? They brought her in front of the medical council and said, what are you doing this? And this is my patient's cystic fibrosis. They're not supposed to sit in a waiting room with each other. But also, the patient you're talking about didn't report me, a member of the public did. The patient who reported me, the person who reported me, knows that patient because they're on the TV all the time raising money for cystic fibrosis. They're on the local radio. There's a picture of them in the local supermarket raising sponsored runs. He says there's no privacy. We were talking about coughs on how much sputum was coming up on a Skype call. This isn't a real privacy thing. So I think it really comes down to why you're doing it, and if you can cover your back, I would ignore most of the regulatory because it's being written by people who haven't got imaginations.
Well, I suppose the only point I would go back to, though, is that we shouldn't, sat in this room and the people developing apps, not do things because of regulation. We might be using it as an excuse, just to not get involved in this stuff. Perhaps actually we should just dive in and and make sure that we can do it and deliver it and get it out of the way.
We did a project quite a few years ago now, actually, like 2009, 2010, and it was very much part of this debate around like medical devices or apps, and it was a PASI calculator, the PASI app. It was for psoriasis. It allowed you to very quickly evaluate the severity of the condition. The concept was discussed with the then medical director at the organisation. He was talking about, it takes a real long time to diagnose severity. You've got dial, you've got some mass, It was quite tough. We were sat in a room going, that is perfect for the iPhone, absolutely perfect. And to your point, it was built and released in something like 4 to 8 weeks. It was fantastic. And literally, it was just a bright idea with a real need. Yes, it went on to then spark a debate, but it's been downloaded like 60,000 times. It's got an average user interaction of 10 minutes. It's available in 100 markets. And to your point, we were a bit courageous, a bit bold, we were innovative, and I think it's added value. Yes, there's been debate around it following that, but I'm still pleased we did it.
So I also wanted to sort of think about the fact that even with the regulations that have been published for now, there is a sort of sense of schizophrenia, even in those regulations themselves, that, I'll go back to the FDA guidance again. You have apps that will not be regulated, you have apps that will be regulated, and you have apps that are regulated, but they're low risk, so they won't be enforced. Unless you're a bit of a specialist, you really aren't going to know.
And to add to that, there are the same calculators that are actually available on websites, and they will not be regulated at all.
Exactly.
That's the most schizophrenic thing about it.
It's ridiculous. And how do you then also make the distinction between what is a native app versus what is mobile web? Because then if it's on the website, but it's on a mobile web, does that make it a device?
Why would you care? It just doesn't make a difference, does it?
Exactly. So back again to the point that says, if you've got the right value prop and you're complying with your ethical obligation to make sure that you are keeping it up to date and that you're doing it for the benefit of your patients, then who cares if you're regulated? Who cares?
I would like to add also to something that Nick said before. It's about just like if you're ethical correct, right? Why wouldn't you go beyond compliance, let's say, and launch this app? I think one of the main problems in many markets is that there are so many other companies and lawyers just waiting for you to go this step beyond, and then the whole machinery of suing and just like I don't know what's the English term for it, but just like that you have to take the app down and all of those things. And whenever this machinery starts, people in the legal teams get feared again. So I can understand from a personal internal perspective of those legal people, they would rather step back from it, because if they get sued, it's their issue, and sometimes they have a personal obligation to it, right, in the companies. So I think probably the solution to all of that is stop suing each other. Probably that's the solution to all the problems, as long as you can identify an ethical, positive thing about it. So probably go back to your companies and tell them stop suing other companies. The
two companies that could have actually done anything about it, Google and Apple, they're actually exempt. So even though Apple's getting 30% of all the money made on these apps that are being downloaded, apparently they're just a device provider or whatever. So there's a whole load of that they're missing the real. And if you look, we've already had this happen with online advertising. So all these big Canadian and dodgy pharma sales companies that used to Google advertise and help Google build their massive model of online advertising in the early days, people going online and buying ads. And they were buying ads from dodgy companies that were selling counterfeit drugs, causing a huge amount of brand problem for the companies that are in this room. It's already happened, This already happened to the online market, and we weren't allowed to advertise online, so all the scammers were doing it. And so in many ways, I see the same thing happening here, and the replication of apps. I'm sure that some of the innovations you've put out have been copied by other people, and now they're out there and they're making more innovation grow on top. So,
Yeah, I mean, we get our best ideas from looking out to see what other people have done. It's a great way to innovate. I was reading something the other day, and I thought it was just a really interesting point for what we're now discussing. And that was it was all talking about Apple, it was talking about Steve Jobs, and it was talking about the fact that when they started way back when, they weren't driven by design. And their biggest barrier to design is that design was at the lowest level in the organisation. And by the time it got to the very most senior level, it was completely watered down. I think one of the biggest challenges we face, but I think it's changing, is that some of the innovators are the people, in the less senior positions. And I think the biggest change I'd like to see is get the innovators to the most senior level in an organisation, because it will completely change the culture and will be very much a culture of innovation rather than at the moment a culture of fear.
Well, top tips really on how do you change the culture in organisations that don't want to innovate or are scared to innovate?
That's an interesting question. I actually had, I think, like 3 different conversations with 3 independent people asking me the same question today about how could there be a cultural shift. So yesterday there was this round table with led by Paul Dixie, where there was also this topic. I think it's so hard to tell. What we are trying to do, we in terms of the agency that I'm working with, we're trying to get hold directly of the most senior managers in the country, actually, and trying to gain, to give them some knowledge about what's going on there. There are some other models, like I mentioned it today with somebody. It's like reverse mentoring or something, right? Where middle to low management levels would actually educate the top senior management in a positive way, in a secure environment where they would not give too much of themselves, and educating them about what's going on there today. Because in the world that they are working in, they do not have the time to look at all the things that are happening there. So if there would be this trust basis, I think, is the foundation of all of this. But then there are lots of ways how to deal with it.
So I've said this before, can be a little controversial, but never mind. I always say, if you've got to get people to do something, you have 2 options. You have a carrot and you have a stick. And carrots can be things like good education, help people to understand what is the benefit to them of the change that you're proposing, work with them, build that level of trust, build the relationship, back to relationships again, build the relationship, be totally transparent about the objectives that you have, what you're trying to achieve and why, and what's in it for them. Then you use your stick of getting your senior sponsors in, get them on board, get the buy-in, and build it into what Michelle was saying this morning, build it into what are your performance measures, build it into part of the corporate culture, build it into corporate policy, as you need to do. I think you've got to attack it from many different streams rather than just relying on one mechanism to change a culture.
I'm convinced this will split the room, and definitely Twitter. So one of the best starts to a conversation is, we've had this amazing idea, we want to do it. The worst second half of the conversation is go, and we want it to be enterprise and global from day one. That is incredibly difficult, because you go from being able to work really agile, really iterative, really quick, really passionate, really dynamic, get it in the market, see if it's a success. It is brilliant, let's make it global. As soon as you start thinking about, well, what about the complexities, the technology, the different markets, how are we going to get the buy-in, it becomes so much more difficult. When that Pazi app I spoke about is dead successful, we launched it in the UK, it was unbelievably cheap, and then, and it was really successful, and someone goes, oh, we need to make it global now. And I had to turn around to them and say, well, we're going to need to rebuild it from scratch. I was not embarrassed by that in any way, shape or form. It'd been spectacularly successful. Version 2 could easily be localized and roll out across the world. So for me, a key part is, let's be really innovative and really quick, prove the success, build a case, take it global. And the second thing, which I think is interesting, is we tend to work in a most unbelievably linear fashion. We go through paper, we go through approval, blah, 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 blah. I would absolutely advocate much more of a product design approach, where it's much more around quick, disposable prototypes and agile development. Get people excited by what you're doing, let them feel what's taking place. And that, for me, really changes quickly, certainly the culture of the team associated with that project.
I believe strongly that, culture change, yes, can come from the bottom, but it really needs to come from the top. And I think the problem for pharma companies, and this might be controversial, well, it is probably. The problem for pharma companies is that people at the top of pharma companies, because they're old companies, generally they're all pretty old and it's an old tradition of business, are at the top of pharma companies because they're good at getting to the top of pharma companies. And they're all actually quite similar. Now, the organisations that we think of as really breakthrough, the Googles, the Apples, even Microsoft in its day, they grew quickly from real entrepreneurs thinking differently. And we need to put and companies now to find a way to put bright, lateral thinking people at the top of their organisation straight away. Because at the moment, in terms of compliance culture and ethical culture, as far as I see going into lots of companies, they're all pretty much of a muchness. And I think there is room for some to stand out and do things differently.
My little takeaway would just be champions. And I think organisations that produce conferences like this give an opportunity for that. But as you're producing great apps, get someone out there from the company talking about it, because that just becomes contagious, because everyone wants to copy that or headhunt him. You know, we've got a very flat, small world these days, and people who are in audiences like this can see good stuff when we see it. You show me a good app, you tell me it's got 60,000, I go out there and I'm still cynical, I have a go on it. Hey, guess what, this is something. Now we're either going to steal you and bring you over to our company, or we're going to copy what you're doing and put our champion up there next year talking about it. So I think we making these champions, giving people figureheads, because if it is a young person, no one's still going to take him seriously. You can put him in front to educate his people, but when he hears that everyone else is going crazy about his ideas and his numbers of his apps he's getting merit, I think that to me would be the best example.
Do you think pharma are going to break some boundaries, or do you think it's going to be through partnerships? What are the opportunities?
I'm going to ask the question, does it need to be pharma that's breaking the boundaries? Not traditionally something very good at. And when it comes to anything, there are plenty of consumer organisations who've already raced off into the distance. So for the foreseeable future, I don't see farmers breaking any particular...
We're on different sides of the fence here, because I think pharma is the champion of this whole market. So if we look at the retail pharmacy experience, if you go back, so I had one of the biggest retailers of a pharmacy store, independent pharmacy store, and he was saying, I don't get it, all this stuff. Tell me why this is important. And I said, do you remember your stores 20 years ago, 15 years ago? And he was like, nothing's changed. I was like, yes it has. You had the whole front sponsored by a Kodak. You know, Kodak were actually paying, you were doing photo development. And the problem was, people have convinced them, investment bankers have convinced them that it was everyday low prices in the supermarket that lost them the footfall. But it was actually photo development. And photo development, in case you don't know, disappeared because we got digital cameras on our mobile phone. We started using Facebook. That killed the foot flow. You know, you bought camera film, you went to get it developed. That was huge footfall for pharmacy retailers. What they should have done is seen this was going to swap out that business model and started selling mobile phones. And actually the Vodafones of this world would be the pharmacy chains. That didn't happen, but they're not missing it this trick. You know, I think it's looking at over 500 million this year has been made by Walgreens in prescriptions to mobile phones. They made more money in the first 18 months with their mobile initiative than they made in a decade with Walgreens.com. That's a huge opportunity that's actually causing the American Medical Association to say, hey, stop being the doctor. So that's a phenomenal thing. It might be outside our scope, it might be the retailers that we sell to who are being the innovators, but there's nothing to stop us actually working with that client, because that is one of your principal clients.
And it's very local as well.
Absolutely local. But it's where you're going to buy these equipment. So, you know, one of the initiatives that's going on with the AliveCore is they're actually bringing this into pharmacies in Ireland. So every pharmacist in it's called Silicio's Lloyd's Pharmacy now, Doc Morris, has got an iPad. There's nothing to stop them putting this, and patients on multiple medications or over a certain age, pharmacists actually screening them. GP's not interested in it, he doesn't even want to ECG people. The pharmacist wants to get in this area. It's a great opportunity for him to make sure that he's medicating people safely. You know, he's not causing them to have irregular heart rhythms because of the drugs, the interactions with the drugs. So I think you've got a phenomenal... You've also got the packaging that every patient's got in his pocket today. No one else has got that legacy sticky thing in the pocket. And if you go to Japan, you see the packaging and how you can jump off packaging with QR codes or whatever the next things are. I think that's... I think pharmacy is in a very enviable position to lead this market, and it can't let happen what the last decade happened, where it lost that, you know, that customer ownership and relationship.
Agree. I think, though, what's also interesting is understanding, because I agree from that point of view with the pharmacy-led stuff rather than pharma-led. Yeah, absolutely. There's some fantastic innovations, and interestingly, I'm going to go back to a technology standpoint. We start looking at this idea of the Internet of Things, yes, very boring term, but Internet of Things linked with ubiquitous computing, where you have monitoring that's embedded within your clothing, within your house, within your whatever. And that links in with what's a sort of nascent industry at the moment we see growing, which is this telehealth, long-distance monitoring of patients, et cetera, I'm very interested to see how that's going to evolve and grow over the coming years. And I think that's an area where you can plug the HCPs back into the conversation, because it's not just about patients monitoring themselves and the quantified self, it's about being able to also have the medical mindset doing some sort of monitoring in the back end as well.
Yeah, I see pharmacy retailers move to the edge of their seat when I show them this. It's the Telcare device that does the blood glucometer. But what it actually does is orders new strips. So it knows how many strips it's done, and it orders it directly from the pharmacy. And you say, hold on, you've taken away the input bit. I don't have to just give him prescriptions if he's not using them. So the Internet of Things really comes along a lot quicker when you realise there's nothing needed to be done. It all becomes invisible. You've used this many strips in this device. It knows the strips are running out, and it sends them to you. And that's a very easy sell. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to that point that I'd definitely like to see happen over the next few years is a shift from focusing primarily on like digital for communications and more into like digital for like services. And I think that's like a really interesting area for us to go, and hopefully that's where we'll go in the future.
What do you think of the ethics of a pharmacy retailer being involved in care? Because you've got the doctor background and you've got...
I'm a doctor, don't ask me about the ethics of pharmacists. On that note. No, it's, again, as long as things are patient-focused and it's in the patient interest and people aren't protecting their own, whether it's pharmacists or pharmaceutical companies thinking about their own needs above those of the patients, that's the main thing, and profits will follow from us following that principle.
I'm sure you've all seen the Medtronic CEO when he started engaging with a patient who had a pump that was having a problem. I think the world's so small and so flat, and you've got CEOs talking to patients now. I don't think anyone can get away with many of the things that they thought they might have been able to before. So I think we've got a check and a balance that's actually been brought in by social media.